crooked cellar door, down a spindly staircase. There's cobwebs and black cats galore, a tired cliche haunted thing. And maybe if these walls could talk, they might even have a word or two.
Hello, and welcome to the Least Haunted Podcast, a place where science, skepticism, anthropology, and humor meet to discuss all things haunting, spectral, spooky, paranormal, and sometimes just the plain stupid. I'm your host, Cody Franks, and joining me today via psychic telecommunication is...
Garth Von Onen. Hi, everybody.
Hey, Garth, how you doing today?
I'm doing good. I think we finally got the setup here. We're in the quarantine version of podcasting, which I think could work pretty well. We got isolated audios.
I think most podcasts actually are set up this way. We were kind of late to the game. We had the luxury of recording in person, but now we're having to do it remotely.
Yeah, that's true.
But yeah, interesting times that we find ourselves in, indeed. When we started this podcast, we recorded our first episode, which is now out, the Jeff the Mongoose episode. We recorded that in November of 2019. And since then, between November and the beginning of March, we recorded 3 other episodes in person. However...
Wow.
Yeah, however, they won't be coming out for a while. They'll be coming out during this stay-in-place order that we have here in California and most of the country and the world. It seems are also under some sort of quarantine or shelter-in-place order because of COVID-19. And that has made things very interesting.
How have you been weathering the storm, Cody?
Well, let's see. We were recording this on April 19th. The shelter-in-place here in the Bay Area began on May 17th, so it has now been 32 days since I have gone beyond the gate on my driveway.
I think you've held to the strictest standards of quarantine of anyone that I've spoken to and I think that's awesome. I've been better about it. The first few weeks, yeah, I have to admit I was like going to the beach and this and that, or I'd say the first week. After that, I started to. It kind of like they eased it in slowly. So at first it was sort of a suggested, and then there were fewer people, and then fewer, and then after maybe 10 days it was pretty serious. And I think I haven't really been out of the house other than to go get groceries since then.
In fact, actually, you got groceries for me a couple of times. Thank you.
Yes, that's right. This is the advantage of being neighbors with your podcast friend. It's you help each other out that way.
I'm kind of observing the quarantine more diligently only because I'm immunocompromised.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, even in my own household, my wife Allison has only left the house, I think, 3 times. So she's just
Wow,
right behind me in our record that we're holding here.
Amazing.
Yeah, it's something. In fact, it's kind of as we're in this quarantine, it's raised a few different questions that I have in regards to our overall topic of the paranormal. One thing that I'll be really interested to see as time goes on, and I've been scouring the Reddits and other social media things that pertain to this, is people who are under quarantine and shelter in place. Are they experiencing higher instances of what might be hauntings in their home? Or are they experiencing less of these experiences? Because my theory is that people generally think their house is haunted because of a combination of things such as natural occurrences that already happen there, general physics, like we've discussed before, gravity in an old house making a door close, or
Yeah, creaks and
stuff like that. Yeah, exactly. But most people don't spend that much time in their home, really. Most people are there at the end of the workday, they eat and sleep there, and then off to the 9-to-5 job the next day. So maybe one of the things that makes someone more prone to believe their house is haunted is they don't feel as comfortable in the home because they're not there all the time.
And maybe they're less familiar with common sounds.
Yeah. It just seems more foreign to you. But now that people have no choice but to stay in their house, are they now more comfortable in the space and are used to all the different creaks, and so they just say, "Oh, it's not haunted at all"? Or if there really is such thing as ghosts and the paranormal, they have more of an opportunity to observe and catch these occurrences, or experience them because they are there.
Possibly.
So
That's an interesting. I wonder how we could ever find that out. The statistics on that. Like, I guess it'll be anecdotal reporting, but maybe there'll be more and more people talking about that. Are there certain subreddits that are devoted to things like that?
yeah, there's our haunted and our ghosts and our paranormal science, and I earlier today I just scoped out on, I think it was our haunted, and somebody had asked the question, "Hey, is anybody else experiencing greater number of ghost sightings in quarantine?" And there weren't that many responses. My favorite was somebody that just said, "Actually, I have seen a pixel move through the air no less than 7 times this week." Okay, a pixel. Like,
I almost think I understand that that's a joke, but I can't tell if it is or how that works.
I think it's a dig at people who constantly post ghost photographs on these subreddits where they ask, "Is this a ghost?" And usually it's just an odd pixel in a picture.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Got it.
But also, so quarantining that everybody is kind of experiencing right now. Turns out this idea of a quarantine or isolation is very, very old,
Right.
and is tied into plagues in general. And I think we should talk about that today is a more broad topic about quarantine and plagues and the ghosts that come from these things.
Sounds like a plan. Let's do it.
All right,
All right, I'm ready.
Garth, what do you know about the plague, or the Black Death, as it was called?
Well, for once, I was actually aware of the topic ahead of time, so I did a little bit of my own research. So hopefully, I'll have something to contribute to this other than going. When I was editing one of our previous episodes, it occurred to me like, wow, I say whoa and yow and oh a lot, but maybe I'll actually have some interesting facts this time. I did know some stuff about the Black Death earlier, like before researching this, but I learned quite a bit more. As to what you were saying about the term quarantine, I believe that was an Italian term and had to do with. Did that start with the Black Death?
It kind of did. At least that term, the phrase quarantine, begins in Venice during the 1400s. In fact, actually, it was an earlier tradition. It used to be 30 days. It was called a Trentino or a Trentine, meaning 30
Oh, and then
is 40.
quarter. That's four.
Yeah, so
40.
it's a
Okay.
term for 40 days. In 1448, the Venetian Senate increased the number of days of isolation that was mandated for ships entering the harbor, or cases of suspected bubonic plague. They already would isolate them for 30 days, and then in 1448 they decided to go up to 40, and that seemed to be an ideal number that allowed any of these suspected cases, if they were actually infected with the plague, it would run its course, or the 40 days was enough that it never showed, the symptoms never manifested, and they could assume that they were safe, and then they could be released. They actually set up a series of hospitals or quarantine stations that were called lazarettos. And they actually, like the city of Venice, had 2 or 4 different lazarettos that were on islands in the lagoon that they would operate and isolate these cases on.
Wow.
But the idea of actually isolating people suspected of being sick goes farther back than that. In fact, even in the Bible, there is instructions. I think it's in Leviticus. They instruct that if somebody in the camp exhibits certain signs on their body, they said like it's a shiny patch of skin that doesn't seem to be doesn't go away in a few days, that you should isolate these people away from the camp for 7 days. At which point the rabbi or the priest goes and checks on them, and if they still have symptoms, then you extend for another 7 days. You handle it in 7-day increments. So that's even the Bible.
Wow. And well, and a lot of,
Yeah.
especially Leviticus, was just about like general sanitation rules and things that they learned over time were probably good habits, along with a lot of superstitious things. But yeah, I can see how that rule would have come from trial and error and experience, that when people get certain symptoms, you got to quarantine them.
Yeah, Leviticus is a series of rules and prohibitions and societal instructions that don't make sense to us, and a lot of them are no longer really socially applicable because the situation in which they arose doesn't exist anymore. That's actually a concept in anthropology that is functionalism, which is you look for the function that a certain cultural role or practice holds, and that kind of explains it. But the problem is that many things that we consider today like superstitions at some point had some sort of societal function that no longer is relevant, but it's stuck around all the same.
Yep, I can see that happening. I've always wondered where isn't one of the rules of Leviticus that you can't create a garment using two different types of fabric? What would be the practical application of that rule? Or like, why? I wonder where that came from.
I don't know if the mixed fabric thing was meant to be literal. That's another thing too. Is some of these are not literal, but they're allegorical, or they are metaphorical. So maybe the thing about the garments is actually a broader statement about being isolated from other groups and not commingling with other groups. If the garment is seen as...
Oh, I see. And they use fabric as a metaphor for the people in the groups. Okay, yeah.
You got to keep in mind that, the context of Leviticus is that it's a small group that's wandering in the desert, and they need to do certain things to maintain social cohesion and also to propagate their numbers. My personal interpretation has always been that's why Leviticus has a prohibition on homosexuality, is actually because they were just trying to...
Well, probably encourage baby making, right? So
exactly. They're trying to condone things that would cause their numbers to increase, not things that would, not produce viable offspring.
No wasting seed. That's precious. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Every sperm is sacred, as Monty Python would say.
We humans don't have that problem anymore.
No. And it was a stupid thing to have in place anyway. It just...
Oh yeah, agreed. I mean, considering the population that would be interested in that, I have a hard time imagining that at any point homosexuality would actually threaten a group of people, and we're all gonna die out because that won't happen.
Yeah, and some of these things also, like, don't eat shellfish.
Mm-hmm.
Well, why? Well, we're in the desert and it doesn't keep, and you get sick. Same with pork. Pork spoils very quickly in a warm climate, and it carries bacteria and stuff like trichinosis. It's just not good. But you can tell people that, and sometimes they'll listen. Or a very good way to get someone's compliance is to say, well, God said that, our deity told us that, and it becomes, now it's this law.
Well, you make the story more sexy. Yeah, people are going to remember that story.
Yeah, so, that's kind of what's going on right now with our COVID thing, that you have these people who are just disregarding quarantine largely because they don't, well, it's not real to them. And they also think that maybe they're being protected by a deity. But, the number of high profile ministers and religious figures who've actually contracted the disease, ironically, right after they said that God would protect them, kind of makes me question either A, the efficaciousness of these prayers to their God, B, how much their God actually is looking out for them. Maybe they're just like, oh no, whatever they're doing is not the right thing, and if there is a God, he doesn't approve of it, so he's going to give them COVID. Or C, he is actually just making them an example as they want to be, and it's like, oh no, let me show the world why you should avoid the COVID. I don't know.
Well, I would be curious what these priests and pastors and people who were, have contracted it, ironically, I wonder what their explanation is.
Right.
I'm sure they could come up with some reason that it makes sense.
However, there is a famous case of quarantining and self-isolation in the past that was actually started by two religious figures, and it ended up saving not only a whole town, but maybe even a region.
Really? What was that?
It's story time. You stepped into my trap.
Is it story time?
You thought it was
tell you're setting me up. All right.
So,
All right, I'm ready.
okay. It is a small village in Derbyshire, England, called Eyam. I think it's pronounced Eyam. It's spelled Eyam. It was named by the Anglo-Saxons, Eyam. Uh, and what happened was in 1666, so about 300 years after the main event that everybody knows as the Black Death.
Oh wow.
In the town of Eyam, the town tailor got a shipment of cloth from London, and it turns out that this shipment of cloth was infested with fleas, and these fleas were infested with Yersinia pestis, which is the bacteria that causes the Black Death. And within 1 week of receiving this shipment, his assistant had died of obvious plague symptoms, and other members of his household were sick as well.
Oof.
And very quickly it spread into the community at large. And many people in the town were starting to pack up and get ready to leave. They were ready to flee the town. Pun intended.
Uh-huh.
Flee. Oh, so the local reverend named William Mopison, he was the town rector, actually, not reverend, sorry, my mistake. He's the town rector. He contacted a local exiled Puritan reverend, so a guy that had been kicked out or driven out by the other Puritans and had found himself in town. That was Reverend Thomas Stanley. So the rector went to this Puritan reverend and said, hey, we really got to do something here. We hold a lot of influence in the town, and people are ready to leave. And last time the plague spread around, it was devastating. Killed so many people.
And it spread through people moving around.
Yeah, so they don't fully understand what caused it, but they do know that people going places spread it. So on June 24th, 1666, hail Satan. They called together a town meeting where they begged everybody in the town to stay home, not leave, and to voluntarily self-quarantine. And surprisingly...
Wow, did it work?
Surprisingly, everybody in the town agreed.
Wow.
To stay put and not leave. And they set boundary markers around the town and left out notes to let people coming into town from various directions, don't go beyond this point, we have the plague.
Wow.
And also, at these boundary stones, there's one that's, some of them still are standing there. One is called the Cool Stone, it's a large boulder. And they would leave money that had been soaked in vinegar on these rocks as drop locations for supplies and goods from neighboring villages. Even though they still don't understand germ theory, they know that vinegar is good for killing bacteria, although they don't know what bacteria is yet. They just know it's good for this, and so they soaked the money in vinegar on the idea that would sanitize it and keep it safe.
That is amazing that they figured that out in the 1600s, because it wasn't until quite a while later that French physicians were even washing their hands, like between excising cadavers and helping deliver children. That wasn't a thing until much later. So the fact that they were aware enough, obviously they didn't know what germs were, but that they knew vinegar might help. That's amazing to me. Wow.
They also these two religious figures were able to establish a few different precautionary rules in the community that were obeyed by everybody. One of them was that they authorized family members to bury their own dead, which is something that before that you had to go to the churchyard, you had to have a minister there or some such figure to perform that. They said, no, it's too risky. We don't want to cross-contaminate. You feel free to bury your own people.
Wow.
They also canceled church services that were held indoors. Nearby the town, there actually is a large natural amphitheater that's just a normal geographical feature. And they said, we'll have religious services in the amphitheater, and they instructed everybody to stay like an arm's length away from each other.
Wow.
So they were doing social distancing. They're like, yeah, don't even get close to each other. Even though it still could be moving in the air, they didn't understand that, but they knew enough. They're like, okay, people need to be away from each other and outdoors. So they do this.
Wow, that's amazing. I had no idea that that something like social distancing, obviously it wasn't exactly the 6-foot rule, but not far off, really, when you think about it. That's amazing. Wow.
Yeah, and they did this self-quarantine for 14 months.
Wow.
Yeah, and at the end of it, the estimates of how many people in the town actually died, there's some contention about this. There's a few different sources, and people argue. One of them was that out of 350 people in the town, 260 died, but 83 had survived. Um, Another count says that actually there were 800 people in the town, and about 400 died. So that's about 50%.
That's about the ratio of the greater part of Europe when when the plague was spreading, a third to a half.
And then the only official church records in the town show that 273 people in the town had died. But yeah, it seemed to work. It didn't spread. Although you have to wonder about where the cloth came from in London. Why wasn't there a plague outbreak in there? But actually, there was. Between 1665 and 1666, there were a few different plague outbreaks in England.
Well, that was something else that I learned in researching this. I knew it had hit Europe maybe 2 or 3 times, but it seems like there were a lot of little mini outbreaks where it just kept coming back year after year.
Well, in fact, the Big Black Death of the 1300s actually might have just been a reoccurrence of her from Roman times. It was called Justinian's Plague, and it struck the Eastern Roman Empire, so the Byzantine Empire, Constantinople, which is now Istanbul. There is no Constantinople.
Not Constantinople.
Yeah, right. That was widespread in that part of the Mediterranean. They were able to trace its spread. It seems like it came from the Asian steppes, possibly along like the Silk Road. They've actually been able to recover DNA from the bacteria that caused Justinian's plague, and it is the same bacteria. It is Yersinia pestis. However, it's like a slightly different strain. It's still Yersinia pestis, which caused the Black Death, but it's a little bit different. And they're actually able to trace that to like a specific mountain range in Central Asia that seems to be where it all originated from, but it's spread around.
I also read about how the plague originated in Asia, like around India or China, and I haven't ever really heard a lot of information about. I mean, I think it hit there just as badly at different points in history, but I never really learned much about it in history class, and I couldn't actually find that much information about it in researching.
It's still common. In fact, the Western United States is one of the regions where it occurs naturally in our wildlife around us, so we are in plague territory. In fact, I was seeing some statistics that was between 2010 and 2015, I think 3,500 people died of the bubonic plague worldwide.
I guess I'm surprised it's even that high. I thought there would have been a cure for it or an inoculation or something.
No, the vaccines don't work against it, although there are several medications that are like antibacterials that seem to work.
I wonder why it doesn't spread nearly as badly today as it used to.
Probably just the conditions in which the plague thrived in Europe are a little bit different than we have now, at least here in the United States. However, it still has a 10% mortality rate. So if you get it, there's 10% chance you're gonna die.
I thought that. See, now, was it a 10% mortality rate in the 1300s? Because I thought it was more like 50%.
No, that's 10% mortality rate with the medications and medical treatments we have today.
Oh, got it. So left untreated, it would be closer to 50. I see.
Yeah. Real quick before we move on from the village of Ayam, going back to the cool stone and the boundary stones.
Oh yeah, what was the cool stone about?
That was the large boulder which they would leave their vinegar-soaked money on in their shopping list, and it really made me think about how you and I have been interacting during all of this. On my driveway, there's the gate, and we have a kind of like a wooden hutch with a mailbox for like package delivery.
It's great. I'll drive up in my car with some groceries and I'll park right in front of the gate, and here comes Cody, and he's wearing the mask, and we'll have a conversation like 20 feet apart, and I'll take the groceries and put them up on the hutch, and then I'll back away, and then every time I drive off, I can see you coming to get them.
Yeah, and actually once I get to the house, there's still a whole disinfecting procedure and protocol that I'm going through.
Well, tell me about that. I haven't heard about this.
So because the COVID can survive on various surfaces for different periods of time, I think days for like cardboard. In fact, one of those cruise ships, they said they were still finding it in the cabins 17 days later. It was still there.
No kidding. Oh my gosh. I thought it was just a couple days. Wow.
No, so what I do is I fill my sink with cold water and I put a little bit of bleach in there. And any produce gets dipped and it just sits there and floats in the water for about 10 minutes before getting rinsed really well. That seems to be enough to kill the virus in those. And then once it's rinsed, it's, and, any paper goods and stuff, well, if it's just paper and a non-perishable thing, I actually have been isolating it completely. Like my mail, I have been leaving on my dash so that it gets exposed to the sun for a couple of days before I even bring it into my house. So my mail is all of like...
I've heard that helps, like, exposing it to the sun, because it'll fry things. And
yeah, then other things are just getting wiped down with Clorox wipes. And now Clorox wipes, you have to understand, just wiping them does not disinfect. You need to, and if you read the package, it'll tell you, you need to wipe whatever it is you're cleaning so that it develops visible moisture on it. It has to be wet. And it has to sit there for 30 seconds before it's efficacious.
Oh, that's good to know.
Just wiping a disinfectant wipe on something does not do the trick. It has to have prolonged contact is the only way it works.
I've had, my procedures have not been that rigorous, but, whenever, Kelly and I go to town to get groceries, we'll, as soon as we get home, we leave the groceries out on the porch, and then, we'll take our shoes off. I've got going to town shoes that I don't wear otherwise. I don't wear in the house.
Oh, good.
And then, as soon as we get in, clothes go right in the hamper. Take a shower, get in fresh clothes, and then the hamper's just, basically on the edge of being outside of the house, and we just wash those clothes as soon as possible.
Yeah, we have a separate laundry room, too, that you have to pass through you have to walk by. It's a separate shed on our patio.
Uh-huh.
So we've been isolating things there, too.
That's a great way to do it, yeah. Especially for that, because you're leaving them out in an outdoors or in another room from the rest of the house.
But you also have to be mindful of where we're storing things, because in the last week we have killed 5 rats in our house. Well, not actually in the house. One was under the sink in a separate compartment, like in a crawl space, and 4 more were right on our front porch. Don't want the plague,
I was just thinking about the metaphor of the plague. Wow, 5. Yeah, I guess you don't have any cats, do you?
No, we have a dog, and she's
your dog's a ratter.
Yeah. But these still are finding a way in. I don't know. And it's just like, just go away. I don't want to kill you, man.
I have one of those have a heart traps. It's like it's a little box with a spring on it, and then they flip the thing, and then the door closes. So, I was catching a lot of rats in the last few months. I think I was able to patch up the holes in the house, though. That I haven't seen one for a couple weeks now.
Hopefully, our rat infestation will go down.
Well, the advantage of capturing them alive is when you let them go, they go springing away and bouncing off into the woods. It's pretty cute. Anyway.
Oh, real quick, again, one more thing about Iam that I forgot. The Plague Town is just so fascinating. So, in the 1980s, in the 1990s, there was a gentleman in San Francisco who was very shocked during the AIDS epidemic that he did not seem to contract HIV. But everybody around him did, and he was participating in what would be called risky behavior. He's gay, by the way. He's gay, and had his partner succumbed to HIV and died. But he still was not getting it, and so he was trying to convince doctors to check him out. He's like, "Hey, there's something going on here," and they finally did. He had a mutation called CCR5 Delta 32. And it seemed to hamper the way in which HIV could infect immune cells.
Wow.
Turns out that this mutation is fairly common in Northern Europeans and in other parts of Europe where the plague happened. And it seems that...
is there some correlation between the plague and AIDS? I thought AIDS only jumped to humans in the late 70s.
No, there's not a real connection between the two, other than they both attack the immunity cells in your lymph nodes in the exact same way. So plague infests the body in the same way that the HIV virus does, or a very similar way. So the theory is that the plague acted as an artificial selector.
Oh, and the people who survived happened to have that immunity because the ones who didn't died and didn't reproduce. Wow.
Yes. In fact, the guy who kind of brought this all attention, the guy that wanted to get tested, his name was Steve Crone. He actually was of European descent and had ancestors in parts of England that experienced the plague. So, after they made this discovery, scientists went to Iam and found people who had they could trace their lineage back to the town's quarantine. Their families had never left.
Wow.
And these
And that was
people
that same town. Amazing.
and these people had the CCR5 Delta 32 mutation. So the reason why those people who survived the quarantine in the town was it selected that mutation. They had the mutation and it survived. Where the mutation came from originally, there's theories that it might have arisen from far north Europe and actually might have been the Vikings. And so as they were going around raping and pillaging through Europe, they were spreading this mutation into the gene pool. Flash forward, the plague comes in and wipes out everybody who doesn't have the mutation.
The twisted fate of history. Wow.
Yeah. But a lot of people died still, and that leads to ghosts, right?
Yes, when there's a lot of death, there's a lot of ghosts.
Yeah, so, and that is very much true with the Black Death. You can find lots of stories. I don't know if you looked up any hauntings related to the plague, but I found a couple.
I looked up some superstitions involving the plague. We'll get to later, but I didn't hear any really good haunting stories. Let's lay one on us. Let's hear one.
Okay, so the London Underground, right? If you've ever been to London, you've probably traveled on the Underground. It's world famous. It's like when you think of subways, you think of either New York or London. But the London Underground, when they built it, they had to carefully plot their route for all the underground tunnels to go around all the plague pits. Because there were mass plague pits where they buried everybody in mass graves, right?
Boy, it's lucky that they marked where those pits were, because I'm sure they'd been paved over.
I don't think they necessarily marked them all, they just encountered them while they were digging.
Oh, jeez. So they're just digging away, and suddenly there's like bones. Oh no.
Yeah, in fact, one of the engineers had said that, look, the interlocked bones in the dirt are so numerous and have created such a concretion that we can't drill or tunnel through them, so we have to go around them.
Wow.
So there's a lot of unnecessary curves and bends in the London Underground. It's because they're going around plague pits.
So if you're ever on the London Underground and you notice you're making a little loop-de-loo turn, that's probably what that's about.
Yeah, you're going around a big mass grave. And in 2016, there was actually a newsworthy ghost sighting that happened in one of these tunnels, the Knightsbridge Tunnel. Somebody took a picture there, and they claim it shows a ghostly white apparition like leading around a corner. And it just so happens that the Knightsbridge Tunnel is actually right next to a large plague pit, and that's what dictated the location of that tunnel. So people on the underground are very close to plague ghosts, if you believe such a thing. Another one that maybe we'll end up doing a whole episode on just this town, because it's claimed to be not just England's most haunted city, but some people say it's the most haunted city in the world, and that's the city of York. One of the stories pertaining to plague ghosts there is that a house is supposedly haunted by a little girl who, the story is that both of her parents died from the plague, and other people in the village just kind of walled her up in the house, or like didn't let her out because they wanted to quarantine her, and they just left her in there until she starved to death.
Oh.
And so people who now go into this house claim that they will encounter the spirit of this little girl crying for her parents. But it begs the question to me that if her parents were in there too, why aren't their ghosts there? Why just her ghost? They died in the house, and she sat there and wasted away over their corpses. Surely the whole family should be joined together in this haunting, right? But no, they just say it's the girl.
Makes for a more dramatic story, and maybe it was the incredible suffering she experienced that kept her as a ghost while her parents got to move on. I don't know.
As if you know, the plague wasn't suffering enough in any of its three forms, because it had three different forms.
I was going to ask you about that. I saw that, and I know one was the more common. There's the bubonic, pneumonic, and...
Is it sanguinic? It's your blood. One is it affects the blood, one it infects the lymph nodes, and the other infects the airways. I think is how it works.
Right. Now, is that all the same plague manifesting in different... Is it like the same bacteria manifesting itself in different forms?
I think so. I might be wrong.
Yeah, that's the impression I got, because it sounds like it was all the same thing, but depending on the severity, you might experience it differently, and it could kill you quicker or slower.
Yeah, one had a higher survivability rate, and the other, like, if you had the blood form, you were a goner. You started, like, bleeding from the eyes and the pores, and yeah, you just died.
Well, and that's the amazing thing, to imagine that you could get infected in the middle of the day, and by nightfall, 12 hours later, you could be dead.
Yeah, they said generally, like, the bubonic form of it, I think is 10 days after infection, or within 10 days you'll start showing symptoms.
Maybe it was from first symptoms to death then, maybe not from initial infection.
Even with COVID, there's some people who are completely asymptomatic. There's some who have minor symptoms, and there's others who get severe symptoms, and there's some people who don't show any symptoms, and then from the moment the first symptom shows up, within 24 hours, they're dead.
It's so strange because there are people who are in very good shape physically at our age, in their 30s, and have had a terrible time or even died from COVID, and other people who are quite a bit older and survived it just fine and almost had no symptoms at all. It's very strange.
Yeah. Before we get to your superstitions, because that's gonna be fun to talk about, one other thing that is plague related and ties into the origin of quarantine. I'm only going to mention it briefly because as I was researching it, I figured out that just like the city of York, this is a topic that really deserves its own episode to go really in depth. And it is an island. It's in Venice, Poveglia, and it is often cited as the most haunted location on the entire planet Earth.
That sounds like it deserves its own least haunted episode to me.
Yeah, but just touching on it briefly, Poveglia, the island, I'm going to skip over its whole lengthy history because that will be its own episode, like we just said.
People listening at home, I can see Cody has a giant sheet of paper in which he's handwritten a lot of notes on Poveglia, and I could almost read them, but they're backwards in the light.
Yeah, through the camera phone here. Because again, we are isolated. We're not near each other.
That's right.
So in 1776, this island was designated as a quarantine location, one of those lazarettos for Venice, and it was a place where any ship coming into the Venetian harbor had to stop there for the mandatory quarantine period. The reason why it's said to be haunted, and again, I don't want to give too much away because it's such a good topic. I'll just tell you some of the things people say about it. How's that? Some people say that because of it being used as a place for plague, going back to the Middle Ages, the question is, like, how many bodies went there? The idea is that people who were suspected of having the plague in Venice were just dumped on this island to die, is what happened.
Oh.
They said certain surveys of the island have suggested that in some parts of the island, nearly 50% of the soil is made up of human organic remains.
Wow. I wonder if that makes better fertilizer or worse fertilizer than the other islands around.
Oh, it's great fertilizer for ghosts. You can grow some good spooks in that.
Yeah, we need to definitely do an episode on that. That sounds amazing.
There's a few structures on the island. At one time it was used as an asylum. In fact, up until 1968, there was an asylum there. And north of the bell tower on the asylum, a little ways away, there is a stone that has the inscription that, when translated, says, "Do not disturb the dead, for contagion in life resting." And it's dated 1793. So it's just a warning, like, hey, don't dig here. There's plague bodies that are going to infect things.
Wow.
Yeah, there's also stories of, at this asylum, a mad doctor that was performing, like, lobotomy type experiments and awful vivisections and stuff. And it's a real horror show.
Definitely episode worthy.
Yeah, I mean, big spoiler. I'm just going to give a big spoiler here, but people are going to want to know more anyway. It's all fucking bullshit. Sorry for the language.
Oh no! Cut that out. Everybody pretend you didn't hear that. Although it would have been pretty cruel. It would have been pretty bad to do a whole hour on this and then in the last 10 minutes be like, "Oh, by the way."
Well, yeah. Well, also, like, I know there's people who are listening at home who have heard of Poveglia, and they're like, "Oh yeah, I know all about this," because it has been visited by so many ghost shows and researchers and quote unquote ghostberts who have gone there to check it out.
Is that a thing? Ghostberts?
No, I think it's a term that I'm just coining right now. A ghostbert is somebody whose expertise might as well be a ghost, i.e. non-existent.
Not very substantial expertise.
Yeah, they go to this island and they've filmed shows and gathered their evidence, all based on these false histories of this island that aren't true. They claim that it was, going back to the Middle Ages and the 1300s plague outbreak, that's where they were dumping people. And so hundreds of thousands of bodies were put there. In truth, it's somewhere between 20 and 100 individuals who died there of the plague. And even that was between 1790s and the 1870s. So
that's probably the average of all of the land that is frequented by human beings. I mean, that's a very low number of dead people per year.
Yeah, so like I said, we're teasing an episode in the future. We'll go into more in depth into it, because I can really dig into the history, and it ties into the origin of quarantine. But I feel it's something that deserves its full episode to give it its what it deserves.
Yeah, for sure. All right, let me go through some of my notes here. Officially, the plague met landfall in Sicily in 1347. Now, something that amazed me is that by the year 1400, this is 50 years after the plague began, in addition to other epidemics, the world's population had gone from 450 million to between 350 and 300 million in that time. So you're imagining the whole population of the world was about 500 million people, and it dropped by, looks like close to a quarter potentially over the 50 years between 1350 and 1400, mostly due to plague, but other epidemics as well. It's just amazing to me, the history of humanity, how much the population could fluctuate back then.
We've come very close to being completely wiped out on more than a few different occasions.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine that happening now, just because the numbers are so high. But if you got the right thing.
Is it though? Is it that hard to imagine right now?
It's easier. It's easier today than it was a month or two ago. That's for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so there was one thing that I learned about as far as people back then didn't really know what was causing the plague, and there were various ideas about what caused it. In 1348, King Philip of France asked several of the great medical minds in the University of Paris to report back to him on the cause of the plague. They had reached the conclusion that it was a configuration of the heavens. Specifically, they wrote that in 1345, quote, at 1 hour after noon on March 20th, there was a major conjunction of 3 planets, that's Saturn, Mars, and Jupiter, in Aquarius, adding that they noted that there was a lunar eclipse nearby. And there was actually a poem that was written in which the Black Death was mentioned for the first time. This is in another language, and it has to do with that. Shoot, I'm messing this up. I'm not good at reading notes on the fly here. We can cut a lot of this out.
Not so easy now that you're the one with the notes, huh?
No, it really isn't. Boy, Cody, you're great at this. Anyway, cut all of this out. Oh my god. Yeah, so to continue with that quote, they said, for Jupiter, being wet and hot, it draws up evil vapors from Earth and Mars because it is immoderately hot and dry, and then ignites the vapors, and as a result, there was lightning, sparks, noxious vapors, and fires throughout the air. This was their explanation for what was happening in the heavens that caused the plague on Earth.
So, like, swamp gas.
Swamp gas trapped in a weather balloon, or what was it in Men in Black?
You just saw Venus through some trapped swamp gas.
Swamp gas from a weather balloon was trapped in a thermal pocket and refracted the light from Venus.
Yeah, that's right. Later on, they had refined this idea of gases to be more of a miasma, and
miasma theory.
This is what led to the bird mask, the plague doctor's bird masks, and the main reason for the bird mask that was developed by a guy, a 17th century physician named Charles Delorme. He was a physician to several different French kings, and he is known for having created this bird mask. It looks like a bird. We'll have some photos in the show notes, but it's that classic plague doctor mask.
Yeah, I know the one. It's pretty creepy.
It is. It turns out it wasn't very effective. Well, the reason it was shaped like a beak is they would put all kinds of very smelly things into the beak part so that physicians couldn't smell the rotting people they were helping out. The idea being if you smelled the dead body, you were more likely to actually get the plague, which is actually not terrible reasoning.
Well, it's true with COVID. If you can smell someone's vape, you are too close.
Exactly, and so people have an intuitive sense of that. And even though the actual plague mask wasn't that useful, it basically just made it so you couldn't smell the bodies. It was a step in the right direction.
However, I gotta say about the miasma theory, because I am somewhat familiar with it. It wasn't just that the smell. They thought the smells were what would make you sick, but you could either use something that smells really good to overpower it, but also you could use things that smelled equally as bad, which led to people huffing human feces to try and drive off. Also, in certain places, they would put big old pots of burning pitch in the streets for this thick black smoke because they thought that the thick black smoke would also.
They thought the smoke would clear it out.
Yeah.
Ironically, DeLorme lived to the ripe old age of 96 years old.
That's really old for that period.
He might not have had a great cure for the plague, or his costume was mostly ineffective, but boy, he lived to be a ripe old age, so that was fortunate.
Maybe he had the CCR5 Delta 32 mutation.
It's quite possible. There was another famous plague doctor who gave medical advice that was actually incredibly accurate for once, and that was Nostradamus. His advice was the removal of infected corpses, getting fresh air, clean drinking water, and drinking juice from a preparation of rose hips. That's a little bit whatever.
Actually, well, rose hips are high in vitamin C.
And he suggested not to bleed the patient, which was against the prevailing theory at the time, which was one of the common cures for the plague was, we got to bleed the patient, and it can be transmitted through blood, among other things, and will not help the patient. So,
well, also, you know what cures everything? Death. Being bled to death would cure anything.
Yeah, that's true. Once you're dead, the plague will die with you. So we got it.
Okay, you don't have the plague anymore. You also don't have life.
And there were a number of other famous physicians who helped out with the plague in various capacities. The sad thing here is people were doing their best. We can laugh at them for having the wrong approach or for not knowing about very obvious things to us. But boy, considering how little science there was on anything to do with germ theory or anything like that, it's kind of amazing what they were able to do. Oh yeah, my other note was on scapegoats. Obviously, one of the main superstitious reactions to the plague was, who is there to blame? And as you might expect, a lot of people used the Jewish people as a scapegoat. And there are several instances documented of Christian mobs attacking Jewish ghettos, and there was one point where I think they burned 2,000 Jews alive in Strasbourg. Looks like in February 14th, 1349.
Why does it not surprise me that it's Germany?
Yeah. Wouldn't be the first time or the last time.
And you see the same thing going on right now. There are groups that are being scapegoated over COVID.
Absolutely.
There has been many cases reported of people, Asian Americans, being assaulted and attacked. I mean, it started with, people using our own president for a while struggling to call it coronavirus or COVID-19. He kept calling it the Asian flu or the Asian virus.
Or the Chinese virus.
I've heard some of my dad's friends say Kung flu.
Oh, jeez.
Yeah, it's just...
Well, that's not an uncommon thing for people. If you're upset about the situation and you're looking for someone to blame. I'm not suggesting that that's a reasonable reaction, but it isn't surprising.
No. The Spanish flu is also one that, that was the last thing we have really in our own history to compare this to. The most recent...
I may be wrong about this, but I think the Spanish flu in Spain is called the French flu, and in France it's called the German flu.
Yeah, exactly. Nobody wants to be the one who's associated with it. Two other things that operate in the same way is... syphilis was always called, depending on where you were, it was the French disease. But if you're in France, it was, it's the Italian disease. And if you're Italy, it's like, so they all would accuse somebody else of it. So it had different names in different places. The other thing is the German cockroach, which is a very common household pest worldwide now. I think like Southern California's got it real bad. My father-in-law's house in Phoenix, Arizona's got them real bad. They call them the German cockroach, but again, the Germans don't call them that. The Germans say it's the Spanish cockroach or the Portuguese cockroach. And so it's just...
If you go very far back in the history of those terms, it's all just to do with like blatant racism.
Pretty much.
That's these guys. Those are the foreigners who are coming to invade us, and they're bringing their cockroaches with them.
Xenophobia,
Xenophobia. Well, I remember before... the COVID-19 had just landed, and we were just getting reports in Seattle, and I think there was maybe one in Santa Clara, and I remember almost immediately Chinese restaurants weren't getting anybody
Yeah.
coming to eat there, as if they were importing food from China every day. I don't know what people were thinking was happening with Chinese restaurants, but
Yeah.
I'd say it's more ignorance than racism, but or maybe an abundance of caution because you don't know. But it's too bad. It's too bad people jump to conclusions like that.
Yeah, I think it's something that we might. I can't remember if we talk about this in our upcoming episode about witchcraft, which will be airing in a couple of weeks. Um, but people seem to have this. There's this thing about humans where we feel like if we can name something, we can control it, or if we can some kind of control over it will make us not feel powerless or helpless. And so, if you can, that's where the blame comes in. If you can blame somebody, it's like, oh well, this.
Blame Jeff the mongoose.
Yeah, well,
that'll really relieve tension.
You find something to blame.
But yeah, no, that is true. If you can just name the thing that you're angry or upset about, it can help. Help you feel a sense of calm and control, even if you're not in control.
Yeah, but of course that has all kinds of unforeseen negative consequences because where does it end, man?
You may well have heard about this. I was trying to look at like positive things that the plague brought us, and there are a few. No doubt everyone's heard of this a few times, but I wanted to get into a bit more detail about Isaac Newton.
I have heard something about a connection, but yeah, you go ahead.
So Isaac Newton was a very interesting character. He I'll do a very brief history of his past because it's just interesting imagining growing up in the time that he grew up in.
Real quick, the audience should know you have a training in astrophysics, correct?
Yes, I have. I am an amateur astronomer, and I studied astrophysics at UC Santa Cruz. Yes, so I know a little bit. We can get into all the details about Newton's laws of gravity if you want.
Well, later I think we'll come back at another time. We should do look at how Newtonian physics interact with ghosts. And do they obey the laws of physics?
We could set up some experiments. It shouldn't be too hard. Newtonian physics is remarkably simple for as complicated as people assume it is. That's what's so beautiful about it. So Newton, his father died a few months before he was born. He disliked his stepfather and maintained enmity with his mother for marrying him, which is revealed from a list of sins that he confessed to at the age of 19. He was a religious guy, and he would confess his sins. He said his sin was threatening my father and mother to burn them in the house with them in it.
Holy crap!
Newton's mother had 3 other children in the second marriage, so he was already feeling some tension with him and his mother. He did, however, go to the King's School for a number of years, and he had to come back, and his mother tried to talk him into becoming a farmer because she owned a farm, and he was very much against that, and he fortunately was able to go back to school, and he became distinguished in building sundials and windmills. He was admitted to Trinity College, Cambridge in 1661.
Just in time for the plague outbreak.
Yes, exactly, and he had just received his bachelor's of arts, and then the plague hit. And that was actually when he was had worked out a binomial theorem that led to the creation of calculus, which hadn't been invented yet. So he was already on the cutting edge of that, but you imagine this incredibly gifted student, he just got his degree, and then the plague hits. So quarantine, he goes back home to the farmhouse, and for the next 2 years he's stuck at home. In that time of isolation, he worked out a theory of gravity. He figured out how rainbows work, how the tides work, and basically constructed all of the math for physics. He was 22 years old.
All you got to do is go on the internet right now, and you'll see all the 22-year-olds' creativity coming out in quarantine. I mean, they're not all making groundbreaking scientific discoveries. Most of them are learning how to make a sitcom starring only themselves and using Photoshop.
but they have the they're fortunate enough that they can share that with people. That's the thing where
Yeah.
we're living in the golden age of being stuck at home because we have all of these outlets to be together apart.
Yeah.
Somebody like Newton was just like staring at the walls. Well, he was able to bring his textbooks home. That's the thing. I mean, when you don't even have the internet, he could read, he could write, and he did have these books from school, and that's all he needed to figure it out.
So everything had to come from his own deductive reasoning and logic.
Pretty remarkable. I mean, I remember when I was 22. I flattered myself from back then. I think I could have figured that stuff out, I thought, but I didn't. And a lot of 22-year-olds think they could figure out, I can, if I think hard enough, I'll work out some new laws of physics, and how many of us do it? But Newton actually did it, so.
Oh, I've figured some stuff out when I was a kid that I think everybody took for granted, but I kind of arrived at it on my own. And so I felt like I was way smarter than I really was.
But you might have had a point, because if no one had thought of it before you would have then thought of it, and you would have been the first.
Oh, well, this one was stupid. This was just that I was on a road trip with my family, and we were driving to Alaska, so we're heading north. And it was in the afternoon, and I looked out, and the sun was setting. And I finally had the realization, like, if the sun always sets in the west, and it is after a certain time of the day, if you orient it so that the sun is to your left, you will be facing north.
Yeah.
Right? But when you're like 10 years old and you come to that conclusion, you feel like a goddamn genius.
Oh, well, that's something I really miss about being that age, because there's this period of time from the age of about 9 years old to 16 or 17 where every 3 or 4 weeks I'd have some epiphany about the world that was just absolutely mind-blowing. And I still get those every once in a while, but they don't come nearly as often.
Yeah.
I developed an intuitive sense for which direction north was I had it for years, and I couldn't figure out how I knew it. And I realized a pattern that on really cloudy days, I couldn't tell where north was. And it occurred to me that I was intuiting what you had discovered at that age, that, you know what time it is and where the sun is. And based on those two factors, you could pretty much guess where north is, no matter where you are.
I mean, not true north, but...
Well, north enough. I mean,
Yeah, north enough, yeah. We haven't talked about ghosts in a while, though. or spooky things.
Oh, yeah, well... this is more of a meandering episode. We'll probably cut a lot of this out. So, Cody, I've always heard that the song Ring Around the Rosie, we always thought it was a cute little children's story, but really it's about the plague, and the roses were used to be nice and smelly to make it so that the corpses wouldn't smell as bad, and all of us falling down is everybody dying from the plague. Did you know about that?
Yeah. Ring a roses, pocket full of posies, ashes, ashes, we all fall down. Yeah, we're burning people, man. Ashes, ashes.
Right.
Although in some versions, you actually, instead of saying ashes, ashes, you make a sneezing sound.
So I was always under the impression that this was an actual thing, but under doing a little bit more research on Ring Around the Rosie, it turns out that there's little to no evidence that has anything to do with the plague.
Right?
Yeah.
It's too convenient.
It is, and there are many other versions of the song that clearly couldn't have anything to do with the plague, even through an analogy. Somebody came up with that idea many years later. So that is a common misconception about the plague.
One of the things I saw, like, it didn't even appear in print until like the mid 1800s.
Yes, yeah, and it was around a lot earlier than that. There's no, you can't prove a negative, but there's really no good evidence that it has anything to do with the bubonic plague. Let me see. I do have some other notes. This is actually interesting. This is less to do with ghosts, but not everywhere in Europe got the plague as badly as Italy and England and some other places in France. Milan, for instance, which is actually in Italy, it's a city in Italy, but it only lost about 15% of its population, and this was due to a much stricter quarantine. They actually bricked up the homes of people who had the plague. So It's pretty grisly because,
Oh.
boy, you find out a family member has the plague, and as soon as city officials discover this, they bricked up your house and just let everybody in there starve. But it, as terrible as it was effective, and in addition, they actually basically laid siege to themselves in the city and wouldn't let anybody come or go. They obviously had to get food, but merchants delivering goods actually left the goods outside the gate. They'd step away, the guards would retrieve the goods, and then leave money for the merchants. So, not dissimilar from what you and I have been doing.
In the people in Iam.
But it turned out that was effective, yeah.
So they would wall people into their houses. They'd make them like it's the cask of Amontillado, right?
It's a little bit like that Edgar Allan Poe, yeah. They bricked them in. Brick by brick, I seal his doom, yes.
Brick by brick, I seal his doom.
Edgar Allan Poe also wrote a story that is a ghost story pertaining to a plague.
Was that the Mask of the Red Death?
That would be the Mask of the Red Death.
That is one of my favorite short stories of Poe's.
Yeah, I mean it's not the Black Plague; it's the Red Plague, right? And
well, yeah, no, it's similar, but yeah, it's not specifically the Black Plague.
Anybody who's a fan of Neil Gaiman and his series The Sandman, one of the graphic novels, I think it was like 2008, it's called Endless Nights. In that one, there is a story that is kind of like the Mask of the Red Death, but it's also based a little bit on that island in Venice, Poveglia. And it's about a rich guy who like walls everybody into his house to stay away from death. And of course, death finds him. But
was that based on the Edgar Allan Poe thing, or was that?
Wikipedia doesn't seem to think so, but I think so.
Also, Poland was relatively unscathed. Historians don't have a clear idea of exactly what caused it. It was probably a number of things. One of which the King of Poland at the time, Casimir the Great, did close the country's borders, setting up an internal quarantine. Of course, a lot of historians say that you can't. They had no capacity to actually close the borders of an entire country, especially back then. That would have been really hard to do.
Yeah.
But Poland is generally somewhat geographically remote, and it took 8 days to get from Prague to Krakow on horseback. So the idea is maybe people who were infected, between 24 and 72 hours, they were going to get sick. So just that little amount of time could have helped as well.
They die on the road before they ever get there.
Yeah, you can imagine a lot of bodies on the way to into Poland, but not as many made it. So it is interesting that you see numbers like a third to half of Europe or a quarter to a third, depending on. Nobody knows exactly how many people died, but it was a large number. But this was unevenly distributed. I mean, going any particular place in Europe throughout the plague, you might find certain little towns barely affected and others completely decimated. And there are plenty of instances where you see the only people who could write at the time being monks writing about how everyone is dying and it is the end of the world, and the entire village died. And that happened a lot. And as far as they knew, when you imagine your average person didn't go more than 20, 30 miles away from their hometown and through their lifetimes, as far as they could tell, it was the end of the world and everyone died.
That just reminded me of what is a classic and great ghost story about the plague. Ingmar Bergman's The Seventh Seal. You ever seen that movie?
I have an image of The Seventh Seal in my mind of someone on the beach playing chess with death.
Yep.
Is that the one?
Yeah, that's Max von Sydow, a young Max von Sydow, and he is playing a game of chess against the personification of death. And the story is set up that he is a knight returning home to Sweden from the Crusades, and he shows up during a plague outbreak. And so everybody is acting as if it is the end of the world.
Wow.
And he decides that he challenges death to the game of chess, and the idea is that if he wins, death can't claim him. It's a classic of cinema. It is a lot of people's pop culture ideas of what death looks like comes from this film. I know that
is he dressed as a Grim Reaper?
He's wearing a black robe and he has like a very white face. And he does have a scythe. He has a scythe. So yeah, it's like the Grim Reaper. In fact, Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey, the sequel to Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. I think they beat death at a game of Battleship or Twister. No, I might be confusing that with the time that the Warner Brothers and their sister Dot challenged the Grim Reaper.
I do believe there was an episode where they do the Bugs Bunny routine on death. Yeah, that was a good one.
But yeah, so the one thing though about the Seventh Seal, again, I recommend everybody go watch it. It's really good.
Okay, I'm gonna check it out. It's been on my list for forever.
And I haven't even been to film school. You know, I'm not just some shill who's telling you go watch the Seventh Seal. Like, no, watch the Seventh Seal. It's a good flick. However, it's complete fabrication in the sense that when the Crusades were going on, there was not a plague outbreak. Like it gives a specific year, and it makes no sense. It is
so the history is
anachronistic.
Lots of artistic license in the details.
But a lot of the images in the film are based on actual like paintings in churches that were painted during the time of the plague. So even the idea of him playing chess against death is taken from I think a church in Sweden, where there's an image of a man playing a game of chess against death.
Oh, I didn't know that was such an old motif. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I think that just about sums up all that we have learned about the bubonic plague and the Black Death of the Middle Ages. Pretty timely topic for these days.
Yeah, in fact, I would like to let the audience know that this was not originally a planned episode. Garth and I decided that we needed to get this out while it was a timely thing. I mean, everything's just kind of the zeitgeist is right for us to talk about this, so we felt like we would have missed an opportunity if we hadn't.
Yeah, I think generally speaking, we want to keep the release, the episodes released in the order in which they were recorded, but if we were to do that, this might not come out for a couple months, and it'd be better to do it now than later.
In fact, if we had kept to that schedule, this episode would have been we would have had a guest. There wouldn't have been a Garth. There was no Garth in this next episode originally.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's one I recorded with my brother when I was visiting him in El Paso, Texas, and it's us talking about our remembrances of growing up in a haunted house.
Right, that was the original episode 3, so will that be episode 4 now? Or are we going to do another one? Because I think you and I discussed maybe doing a 2-parter. First being the Black Death, second being the Spanish flu, the 1818 flu.
Yeah.
We'll have to think about that one.
Yeah, everybody will just have to be on the edge of their seats.
What are they going to hear next? Is it going to be the 1818 flu, or will it be growing up in a haunted house? We don't know.
Or clowns. It could be clowns.
It could be. Oh yeah, it could also be clowns. Really, it could be anything. We'll figure it out.
But one thing we've already figured out is we've got some social media accounts that we would love to plug to our listeners.
Yes, we are official now. Before we were some rinky-dink podcast, but now we got a website. We got Instagram. Oh, anyway, I could list them off. Let's do this in the right order here so people can pull over in their cars. Not that anyone's driving right now.
So you got our website, which is www.leasthaunted.com. There you will find the latest episode and a little bit about us and a place to give some feedback. We're also on Instagram @leasthaunted and Twitter @leasthaunted. And we have a YouTube channel. Our podcast is available as a YouTube video as well for you to enjoy.
Yes, that's right. And we'll be posting everything more or less all at the same time, so you can check any of those things and you'll be updated on new releases, and we'll keep to a pretty regular schedule in theory.
Yeah, we are planning to release episodes every other Friday, so it's 2 weeks between episodes.
Seems like a pretty reasonable pace, and since we've done a few already, I think we're going to be in pretty good shape for that.
And they're pretty long. We'd like to thank you for sticking with us if you have through our meandering conversation.
I like to think. See, I like to go on regular walks at the best of times once a day, and they usually last about an hour, which is about as long as this podcast. So I like to think, yeah, that's about as long as I would want to listen to a podcast.
That's as long as I'd want to listen to me.
Hopefully that works for everybody else, and then we're able to be compelling and engaging for that long.
Yeah. If you've listened
to this episode this far, I guess you're selectively one of the people who, like the people who survived the plague, you've survived this episode, and you have a immunity to being bored by us.
You just got inoculated. Congratulations. Well, that's the episode for this week. Thanks again for listening and joining us on Least Haunted.
Go